You wouldn't have caught her in that picture anyway. Little Emily. Little Emily sneaking under. Oh, I advanced my slide. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to get started because we have a large panel and a lot of really interesting things to talk to you about. My name is Tricia Jedele. I'm the Offshore Wind Policy Manager for the Nature Conservancy. Just a little context setting from me, and then we're going to get started with our panelists. So we have two related panels this morning that will be focused on mitigation, both compensatory mitigation and voluntary mitigation. So our session number 23 and session number 25 on the agenda. These two related discussions may seem a bit out of order to you because, in a sense, we're starting out with what could happen after compensatory mitigation, delivering net positive outcomes. But we felt, as we were pulling these symposia together, that it would be helpful to start here with an eye toward the wider landscape and how discussions are shaping policy in this space. So we're going to talk this morning about what do we mean by net positive impact on biodiversity, or NPI? How does that fit into the mitigation hierarchy? And why are we talking about it in the offshore wind context now or at all? And then following the presentations, we'll take audience questions for about 15 minutes. And after the next session, session 25, we'll have a discussion again and an opportunity for more questions with a joint panel, which will have speakers from this panel and session number 25. So you can go ahead and start submitting questions now via the CVent app that are specific to policy frameworks and tools to support MPI, keeping in mind that we'll have an opportunity to talk more specifically about compensatory mitigation in session number 25. I'd like to thank the Biodiversity Research Institute and NYSERDA for their support and cooperation in planning these symposia and giving space to this important topic at the State of the Science. And obviously, I'd also like to thank our panelists who took a lot of time, invested a lot of time to present to you today on this topic. So let's start. Many offshore wind companies have started to voluntarily set ambitions and develop frameworks to deliver net positive impacts, net positive benefits to species and habitats that their projects interact with. The concept of MPI is part of the mitigation hierarchy, but it has never been a primary focus of it. The goal of the mitigation hierarchy to date has been to get to zero in terms of impacts. So first, trying to avoid impacts, as you can see in the column to the left, knowing that there will be residual impacts that can't be avoided. We then try to minimize the remaining impacts. For example, you might site a project in a particular place with some unavoidable impacts, but then install technologies that help you further reduce those residual impacts. Then whatever is left over is mitigated. Sometimes this is done through compensatory mitigation, sometimes offsets, sometimes both. But the goal always has been to get to zero, getting to that horizontal line that you see in this chart, no net loss. In the United States, each agency and regulatory program have different requirements for mitigation and different acceptable approaches and guidance for satisfying those mitigation requirements. So given this context and the challenges we face getting just to no net loss, it is reasonable to ask, why are we even talking about trying to get to net positive impacts? So in terms of the general policy landscape, there are a few reasons why we're talking about it. Climate change mitigation. Offshore wind has to be deployed at a certain pace and scale. That pace is fast, and the scale is enormous. The Paris Climate Treaty sets the target to keep the global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Maintaining this temperature limit is critical to avoiding the worst effects of climate change. The 2030 UN Sustainability Development Goals, particularly Goal 6, say that in order to limit that temperature increase, we need 380 gigawatts by 2030 and 2,000 gigawatts by 2050 of offshore wind. So when you're looking at the United States goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, it is well below what we need in terms of offshore wind deployment to meet the state goals and to meet this temperature target. And then there's what we know about nature. It's not doing great. We know that just avoiding and minimizing impacts to get to no net loss is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to reverse biodiversity loss and probably won't be enough to halt it. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework commits nearly 200 nations to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. So these large-scale policies influence the pace and scale of offshore wind deployment globally and at a country level. And they have been the drivers for many of the policy actions that you see on this slide, including and especially the criteria-based investing and the biodiversity-related tender criteria in the North Sea. These drivers mean that if a company wants to secure financing, investment in, and win contracts, that they have to be competitive not just on price, but they also have to demonstrate and report on how their projects are benefiting the marine environment and the species that use it. So we are going to hear today, we have a great panel, about some of the U.S. federal levers and policy conversations around MPI, specifically how New York State is thinking about it. We're going to learn a bit about implementation of MPI at the project level and how it's going from Ørsted and RWE. And finally, we'll hear about some of the ways that data tools and regional collaborative bodies can support these MPI goals. I'm going to invite, to start, Shayna Steingard, who's a Senior Policy Specialist on offshore wind with the National Wildlife Federation.
Thanks, Trish. As she just said, I'm Shayna Steingard, and I work on offshore wind for National Wildlife Federation. I'm going to talk about an opportunity to implement net positive impacts through a federal tool, the use of bid credits during leasing. Many of you are likely incredibly familiar with this rainbow infographic, which shows the process that BOEM follows to site and lease areas for offshore wind and analyze and approve projects for construction and operations. Throughout this process, there may be several opportunities for both federal and state governments to require or offer voluntary means for developers to incorporate conservation to mitigate potential impacts from offshore wind development. For example, states such as New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have incorporated required fees as part of their energy procurement, where developers pay a certain amount per megawatt for wildlife or fisheries mitigation, monitoring, or research. In fact, Connecticut has a net benefits aspect to their procurement. Another more obvious opportunity is to require conservation mitigation as part of the conditions of approval of construction operations plan or as conditions of a lease. The opportunity that I'm going to talk about is a voluntary mechanism called a bid credit, which would be offered by BOEM during leasing. At this stage in the BOEM process, impacts from site assessment and site characterization would be the most likely target of a bid credit, and one which could potentially include a net positive impact component. This is a sample table from an environmental assessment. If you're a developer, maybe you can guess if it's yours or not. And it illustrates the range of resources that BOEM analyzes to determine the potential impact from site assessment and site characterization. As you can see from the table, we generally expect limited impacts at this stage, though there are still impacts, and that means there is still a potential to mitigate. BOEM and the services will require developers to mitigate these impacts as conditions of, as conditions of the lease, but there may be opportunities to go further. As you previously saw in Tricia's slide, this graphic shows the concept of MPI, in which negative impacts are take the resource in question below the baseline, and then those impacts are avoided and mitigated to the greatest degree possible to return the resource back to baseline conditions. NPI during leasing would improve the conditions of the resource above the baseline. So what exactly is a bid credit? Under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, or OSLA, BOEM has the authority to conduct a multi-factor auction. This is where the developer's bid for the lease area can be composed of both a monetary factor, their cash bid, and a non-monetary factor, which is a bid credit. And bid credits offer an incentive to developers because while they pay the cash bid up front, they get a credit in the form of the value of their non-monetary bid credit, which they retain until a later time. BOEM is limited, however, in the types of bid credits it can offer under OSLA. So BOEM has to consider the following 8 factors when issuing a lease, which includes several environmental factors, such as the protection of the environment and the conservation of natural resources on the Outer Continental Shelf. MPI can certainly fit into those 2 factors. To date, however, across the, 9 auctions on the Atlantic, there's 2 proposed, and then 4 more proposed and past auctions in the Gulf and the Pacific, BOEM has not implemented a conservation bid credit. The agency has offered bid credits for fisheries compensatory mitigation, for workforce and supply chain development, and community benefit agreements. Recently, however, during the Central Atlantic proposed sale notice, BOEM asked for feedback on the potential use of a conservation bid credit in future lease sales. Many ENGOs joined organizations such as NWF and TNC to discuss what a future conservation bid credit should look like and the characteristics that would make it an effective conservation tool. Broadly, this coalition of ENGOs agreed that a conservation bid credit should meet these 5 standards, and briefly I'll talk about 2 of them in a little bit more detail. The bid credit should be environmentally critical. Conservation bid credit should be granted in the pursuit of ensuring important research, recovery, and or restoration efforts for species and habitats likely to be impacted by offshore wind development. They should also be additive. This is the NPI component. Qualifying activities should be additional to the conservation actions already required under state and federal permits that bring a project back to net zero, and so additive above that line. They should also be regionally relevant, measurable and transparent, and attractive to developers. Again, this is a voluntary mechanism, so we want developers to pursue it. There's some pros and cons to using a conservation bid credit, or bid credits in general. Pros, this is one of the only mechanisms that can direct proceeds from the lease to the impacts or concerns related to the project rather than to the Treasury. It can also be, as the whole point of this presentation illustrates, a great way to direct those funds towards conservation, towards research, towards net positive impacts. It also can encourage developers to engage in additional stakeholder engagement as they are constructing and designing these bid credits. The cons, using an offered bid credit is optional. Winning developers may have engaged in trying to develop a bid credit, and that would be wonderful. But if a developer has spent time developing a bid credit and they don't win the auction, that unfortunately is a potential outcome. And then furthermore, as we've seen, this is unprecedented across all of the auctions that have been proposed and conducted. We've never seen a conservation bid credit to date. And as I'm running out of time, I'm going to unfortunately leave you with a slightly negative slide. These are some of the implementation challenges that BOEM has identified in conversations with them about this bid credit that we need to tackle in order to make this successful. And although I'm not going to read them in detail, I will say that I think an important next step to implementing a conservation bid credit in the 2025 lease sales and beyond is coming together and workshopping these ideas outside of a comment period so that we can address the need for an institution to administer the funds, ensuring that it's attractive to developers, ensuring that it meets the standards that we outlined in slides earlier. Happy to talk more about this. I have lots of slides on conservation bid credits that didn't make the cut, so if you have additional questions, happy to answer them. Thanks, Trish.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you, Shayna. That was great. I'm going to introduce now Kate McClellan Press. She's the Senior Project Manager for Environmental Research at NYSERDA, and she's going to talk with you a little bit about how New York is thinking about MPI and some of the challenges with measuring and implementing MPI at the state level.
Good morning, and thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your kind of continued attention on Friday morning after a long week. And thank you, Trish, and everyone on the panel. This is a really great conversation that Trish has really made sure that we continue to advance. So I'm going to provide a pretty brief overview of how New York State has incorporated some environmental priorities into our state planning and how we have been starting to think about how to address net positive impacts. I do want to say that NYSERDA works very closely with our agency partners. These are my perspectives from my role at NYSERDA, but I know that anything that we end up doing will be done in close cooperation with our colleagues from the Department of State, who I see in the back, and also from the Department of Environmental Conservation. So it is, in the end, a group effort from the state. And these are my perspectives from what we can do through our role at NYSERDA. So you probably have seen this slide before. New York's offshore procurements, we like to say, are not just about electrons, but they are trying to accomplish more than one goal. That includes environmental responsibility, and I think also relevant in this case is that transparent stakeholder engagement. So we're trying to balance a number of things, and we're able to use our procurement and contracting process to help us with those goals. And when we evaluate proposals, it is right now 70% based on price, 20% on economic development, and 10% on viability. And viability includes several things, and one of those things is some of those criteria around responsible development. So through our procurement process, and I should say that we announced our 5th procurement on Wednesday morning, so NY5 is currently open. But that is one way that we have been able to incorporate some of our state goals. And so these are some of the examples that I've pulled out. It's not limited to these, but I feel like these are a couple of good examples. One, we require proposers to submit fisheries and environmental mitigation plans. And in those mitigation plans, a lot of it is how that proposer would approach mitigation, or a narrative about their understanding of the potential environmental risks of their project. But it also includes some things that we have developed in cooperation with our technical working groups that set some minimum standards on mitigation and communication and things like that. So that's in the mitigation plans, and those are designed in that post-award to evolve over time as the project and the developer understands more about their site and as the project advances. They're supposed to do that in collaboration with the technical working group members as well as other experts that they're engaged with. So the second requirement that we have that Shayna discussed is we have financial support that's required at a contribution of $10,000 per megawatt that is going to support regional monitoring of wildlife and key fisheries stocks. And what that looks like on the other side of the procurement process is it's a plan that is submitted back to NYSERDA on how they're going to use those monitoring funds. And then the last example is we require the developers that contract with us to make their environmental and site characterization data publicly available. And again, that looks like on the other side a data management and availability plan that they'll submit to us, telling us kind of how they would approach making that data available. So we don't always dictate exactly what has to be done, and we try to leave some room for flexibility by offering, a way for the developer to propose creative ideas to us throughout those plans, through the mitigation plan, through the monitoring plan, and through the data management and availability plan. And it also allows for flexibility over time. So as we get new information, we can change what we expect in those various things. And I just want to say the reason that we're able to do this and incorporate new ideas into our procurements and evolve those over time in dialogue with our stakeholders and our technical working groups is because the State Public Service Commission order authorizing offshore wind solicitation gave NYSERDA the flexibility to incorporate the advice and guidance from our environmental and fisheries technical working groups on things like best management practices that we've rolled into our procurements. So that's kind of the policy side. And then the other thing that we have that I hope all of you are familiar with after this week is our technical working groups. So they are composed of key stakeholders. In this case, on the environmental side, it's our colleagues from ENGOs, and we have the members from the renewable industry, so offshore wind developers that are active on the East Coast. We have other state agencies as well as federal agencies in that discussion group. So net positive impact has been something that we've all been talking about for a while and has come up as a priority for our environmental technical working group. So it is, I think, another place where we could advance the conversation, we could play a supporting role to advance part of what is needed, and I think that's something that we're looking forward to defining later this fall to figure out, what role can we play to support the process. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to ask Anthony Dvarskas to come on up now. He's the biodiversity lead for Ørsted in North America, and he is going to talk about NPI implementation at the project level from the perspective of a developer. Oh, wrong one. Sorry. Go through this. This is you, right?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Trish. And glad to be here. Thanks, BRI and NYSERDA for organizing this conference. Again, Anthony Dvarskas, Biodiversity Lead with Ørsted for the U.S., and I work across our offshore and our onshore portfolio. I think we don't need to spend a lot of time on this one because Trish mentioned it earlier, and it's come up in some other discussions we've had during this meeting. But for Ørsted, right, the priority remains the avoidance and reduction and mitigation slash minimization side of the mitigation hierarchy. And you can see that forms the base of the things that we do. So a priority for us is at first avoiding sensitive habitats as much as possible in the work that we do both offshore and onshore, and then moving through the minimization measures to make sure that if we can't avoid the impacts, we actually are minimizing the impacts we have. And you're all familiar, and many of them have been discussed at this conference, the kinds of things we might use to minimize impacts, like double bubble curtains and the like, right, on species of concern. And then for those things that can't be minimized, we have restoration and offsetting. And where we're exciting that things are moving is that going beyond the no-net loss and the standard industry practice to get to this NPI or net positive impact level. And what I wanted to spend a bit more time on than this hierarchy is what Ørsted is doing related to that. Because recently, although I guess it wasn't quite so recently, last month now, we released our framework for our NPI ambition. And I should probably give a refresher. Ørsted has a ambition to be net positive for all of its renewable energy assets that are commissioned in 2030 or later. And so we now need to figure out how we're going to do that. And so we're working through the process of stepwise figuring out how to actually put that into practice. And last month we released our biodiversity measurement framework that kind of outlines how each of these steps will align with our project life cycle. Because the next thing we need to do is to go to the asset projects where we're working, or that will have a post-2030 deadline, and actually bring that NPI into the process that they're using, right, from the very earliest stages. And as you can see here, on the bottom, we have the 8 steps of the NPI framework, and then up above, there's the project life cycle. So in the earliest phases of a project, now this is when you're just kind of getting the lay of the land, right? You don't know if you're going to do the project or not, doing some initial screening, looking where there may be opportunities. You would have an early risk screening that goes on. And this is the desktop analysis phase of the work for our NPI ambition, right? In phases 1 and 2 and 3, right? Where we're using existing data, using existing databases, things like IBAT, and the data sources that are there, looking at key biodiversity areas. Are there any that would be impacted by the project sites that are being considered, and deciding how that might affect the decisions on further developing the project. And then as we move through those, deciding to continue forward with the site, we then would look to identify what are the priority biodiversity features at a site, and that's what PBF stands for. Because we know that we can't measure biodiversity of everything, right, for this NPI, so we need to figure out what are the things that are most important. And that priority biodiversity feature identification is meant to be a process of working with desktop evaluation, but also having discussions with stakeholders about what features are of concern to stakeholders. And obviously things that we already have, like endangered species listings, are going to be helpful in guiding what might be priority biodiversity features. Then as we move forward from there, we'll be working on identifying what the monitoring needs would be for those established priority biodiversity features. And now some of those are going to align with the things that we're already going to be doing as part of the offshore wind project development, but others may be not required as part of that monitoring effort. And that's where we have to scope if we need to actually expand out beyond the types of species we were planning to look at as required by state or federal regulations, right? Because it may be that there's a longer list of species that's a concern to stakeholders, that things that come up that are not on an endangered species list that we might not have been expected to monitor for, right? And we'll need to figure out if we need to add additional monitoring to do that. Now, steps 4, 5, and 6 are really where we start to get more quantitative, and we have the studies that start to inform what are our impacts looking like, and therefore what does that mean for what we might need to do for a net positive impact action, those things on the ground that will improve the environment where they're done. And that as you can see, is overlapping with the project development phase, right? So as the project continues to develop and there's site characterization work and there are baseline studies that are done as a part of that project development process, that would then feed into the NPI process as well. But there may be additional studies that we're doing unique to the NPI world that would then inform what kinds of impacts we think we're going to have. So in that step 5, we'd be estimating what those impacts might be. And once we have a sense of how big that impact level is, we then can figure out what kind of NPI actions we need to take, right? And those NPI actions can be things like restoring salt marsh, right? Just to make it a bit more on the ground. Restoring salt marsh. It could be actions that reduce threats to species if we can't find a good restoration for them, right? Like removing ghost gear from water to reduce entanglement risk might be an example of an NPI action for a species. And the important thing is that as we're doing that, this is going to be an iterative process, right? This project continues for a long period of time, right? And we know that understanding of the impacts is going to evolve, and also our understanding of the effectiveness of the actions is going to evolve. So there's going to be a looking back to figure out if we need to adaptively manage and change things on the ground as we're moving forward with making sure our impacts are offset by our actions. And that's where our implementing and monitoring comes into play. And then lastly, of course, we need to report out on all of this in our sustainability reports and our annual reports, and also to financial institutions and to other developing networks like the Science-Based Targets Network and Science-Based Targets for Nature, right, where there's continuing efforts to look at what do companies need to disclose and report on related to biodiversity. And so that will also be a part of what will need to be figured into the operational phase of the project. And so I don't know that this QR code will work here for you all, but just to say this framework is out there for evaluation, and we're very eager to get feedback on the framework itself. If that doesn't work, what you can do is go online and do a search. You'll find it pretty easily, or let me know. Reach out to me, and I can share it with you. But what happens if you solicit input into that, we will get that message, and we'll be able to pull all those together over the course of the next year and continue to evaluate the framework and make sure it's responsive and aligned with what people are thinking in the community. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm just going to get this. I'm going to introduce you to Joel Southall from RWE, who's the Manager of Environmental Affairs and Sustainability. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Good morning. So Manager of Environmental Affairs and Sustainability for RWE's offshore work in the U.S. And I was saying earlier, I wish I could have made my slides this morning, because there's just been so much good conversation and so many ideas that I've had this week, which is a sign of a good conference. So thanks to NYSERDA and to BRI and everybody else that was involved with putting this on. So Anthony just did a good job of getting into some of the specifics in the process from the developer side. So I'm going to stay a little bit more broad on that. One of the things I want to do is give a little bit of background, not just for the sake of background, but a little bit about RWE to show how we are thinking about NPI and sort of where we are in that process. So like I said, I work on the offshore work in the U.S., but RWE is a global company from 1898, starting in Germany, to now being all over the world. And if you started in 1898 and you're still around, obviously been a part of and have really led the energy transition, including a lot of different types of generation. So big recent push into the U.S. offshore market, but also a lot of onshore solar, both in the U.S. and around the world. A lot of stats up here about just how much different types of renewable generation we have around the world, all the way from the development stage in the U.S. through construction, operation, and even on the offshore side of things, getting to the point of decommissioning projects that have been around for so long in Europe. So a lot of experience in how these projects get developed and constructed, but then also thinking about the biodiversity and net positive impact side of things. So specific to offshore in the U.S., the most relevant, obviously, to this conference is our lease in the New York Bight community offshore wind. We also have Canopy offshore wind, which is in the northern of the two California wind energy areas. So we're the eastern lease area out there. And then also in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have those 3 offshore wind leases in various stages of development. And one of the big things that we have from a corporate standpoint globally is a big push towards working on net positive impact. So we have the Growing Green portfolio, which is the renewable portfolio within RWE, which is really, really expanded. And I always have to update these numbers because those are always changing. But that's to expand to 65 gigawatts with $60 billion investment by 2030, with emissions reduction targets of 50%. But on the biodiversity side, RWE's biodiversity policy, similar to what Anthony was talking about, net positive impact for biodiversity for new assets by 2030. And like Tricia was talking about, we've aligned those with those external standards that she was referencing. So the Science Based Targets Network, in line with 1.5 degree target. And we've really used partnerships, largely in Europe, to get that off the ground, and now expanding that to the U.S. So groups like Ocean, which is the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, working with groups to bring in external standards to guide what our internal policies look like. And we've already done that, and we're continuing to do that in the U.S. The reason that I have this up is because I wanted to, like I was saying, talk a little bit more high level. I'm not going to run through these, but to talk about the different drivers that we have for this and the different initiatives that we do. We have very, very few things that are very linear and very tidy. So we have very few things where it's like there's issue A with regulation B, which leads to initiative C, which leads to outcome D with metrics E, and it's perfectly linear, and it's just in that tidy box. So we have all of these different drivers, from things like the voluntary goals that we have to regulations, including, Tricia had some of the EU regulations up, the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities. That applies to U.S. subsidiaries. So we have this interesting interplay where we have an EU regulation that applies here, and then also potential mechanisms for regulations around this in the U.S. All of the different drivers that we have, and then all of the different initiatives we have, it's a very sort of intricate patchwork of why we're doing things, what we're doing, and there's a lot of overlap between these things. So one of the first things, like Anthony was talking about, similar for RWE, is to come up with that real measurable working definition of where we're putting bounds around what activities count towards contribution towards NPI. And then the development of metrics for that, obviously, which then leads to the monitoring, and then the specific initiatives down there. One of the things that I also want to highlight is the need for tools that we can use that incorporate best available science and allow us to get some of that, the things that feed into the frameworks that lead to the monitoring. And Marta's going to talk about a good example of that. So that's another thing we're always thinking about, is how can we work with partners to develop some of those tools. So I'm glad that Marta's going to talk about that. But again, the reason I just wanted to put this up is because as we're working towards defining and working on these initiatives, just a highlight of just how intricate this patchwork and this how all of these things interplay is. So thank you very much, and I look forward to talking on the panel for questions later.
Thanks, Joel. You're doing my job, introducing the next speaker over here. It's all right, I'll take it. As Joel mentioned, Marta Ribera is a spatial ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, and she's going to talk a bit about the role of data and, in particular, the development of the marine mapping tool that TNC is working on to help support MPI goals.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. As Tricia mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit on the role of data, and Anthony and Joel already did a really good job at that, so thank you both for that. I'm going to focus my talk on the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions, but I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about is applicable to the rest of the country, except we're a very lucky region because we're starting from a way ahead point on data and tools, and that's a testament of all the work that Marco and NROC and the regional data portals and now RWC are doing on getting us all together to agree what data we should be using, where are the gaps, how to fill those gaps and all that. So we're extremely lucky that we're starting way ahead in this region. So when we're talking about data and tools and wind energy offshore, we normally been focusing a lot on the one on my right, it's your left, which is like what's there and who's there in the area we want to lease. So that's the base of a lot of the BOEM and NCOS suitability models, and a lot of our feedback has been related to that. But if you really want to advance this process, we really need to think about all the other questions that we have here and many more. And the first one is really what's important. And that, in part, gets driven by what's regulated, so what the government tells us that we should care about. But the other part, obviously, data and tools and a lot of the science that scientists in this region have a really big job, as Anthony mentioned, and trying to fill those frameworks. There's a lot of frameworks on well, we should care about high biodiversity areas. What does that mean? What are the data that support that? So data analysts and a lot of the data and tools have a really big job on highlighting what's important. What are the species that are not regulated that we should be caring about? Other thing that tools should do and can do is try to connect the dots. So we know there are species that spend some time offshore but spend other times in coastal areas or in different places across the globe. So tools should connect those dots for people so you can see throughout that cycle where is the place we should have the most impact. Sometimes it's not offshore, as Anthony was pointing out. Sometimes it's in the salt marshes. Sometimes it's in different locations. So that's extremely important. And finally, it's important to, when we look at data, to put data in context. And that's context spatially, so what areas are important, context temporally, so how species have been using the same habitat over and over again. But more importantly here is context related to wind energy offshore, because the fact that there's an overlap, that doesn't mean there's an impact. So you have to understand what are the impacts related to the activity you're talking about. So, as Tricia mentioned, we built in 2020, middle of the pandemic, yay us, a tool that what's called a marine mapping tool, still called. If you never check it out, this is the link. Please go check it out. It was a tool that was answering a need that the states had at that point to respond in a timely manner to environmental impact statements. It kind of gets a sense of what information you have in that area. Again, the first question I talked about. It kind of unpacks the data step by step, so you don't get overwhelmed with data from right away. It provides context to the numbers, limited context, but some context. More importantly, we think it transparently links between the data you're seeing on the tool and the actual sources. So you can go to the portals, you can go to other sources, so you can extend your exploration as you go along the tool. But we know that data needs have changed across those 4 years. And we think that the tool itself is really well placed to support the MPI goals. So we started about a year ago this process of trying to explore how the data can be, how the tool can be adapted to kind of support those goals. And so we're trying to connect the data to the frameworks throughout the tool in a better way and connect those dots a little bit so people can make decisions and make better mitigation and restoration decisions. That's kind of our goal in general. We're very lucky that we have a steering committee that's supporting us through this process. And it's a multi-sector committee, so we're thankful that they come with us, brainstorm with us, try to figure out how we make something useful for them. So that's kind of our goal, to make a tool that's useful at the end of the day. And I know I'm almost out of time, but the plan of dates that we're looking at is kind of separate what's regulated with what we want to support, and that's kind of agreeing with all our steering committee and with everybody what is the framework we want to follow and how we are interpreting that framework. The more we can agree on that, the better we're going to go. And then connecting the species to the habitats. Why are the species there? Where are the gaps? Also connecting different habitats that are used by the same species, what I'm saying is like connecting the dots. And finally, we know that people access information differently. So some people have mentioned to us that you're moved past to locating an area and seeing what's there. Now you already know the species you care about, so how we start the exploration by choosing the species, and then I can tell you everything that's connected, which is a different way of exploring the tool, but I think like we need to adapt to the ways people have been changing and really support how we get to those MPA goals. And I think that's it. I'm happy to answer questions. This is my email address. If I cannot answer your questions, please reach out, and thank you very much.
Oh, Marta is so awesome. Oh my God. I just love to listen to her talk about all the data stuff. It's not my thing. But I'm making it my thing. So last but not least, we have the director of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, Emily Shumchenia, and she's going to talk a little bit about how our WSC structure and regional science plan can support MPI ambitions of that collaborative. And I'm going to make sure you're set up. There you go.
Thanks, Trish. And hi, everybody, again. So there's some meaty questions in the conference app already. I'm hoping to hit on some of them in my presentation. So you all formed RWSE to tackle issues just like this. So I'm going to start with a word of encouragement. There is a body called RWSE that you all formed that can help. So the slide here shows the different structures within RWSE that I think we can leverage here, right? You have all of the sectors at the table, the federal agencies, the states, the offshore wind industry, and the environmental nonprofits who all care about this as well. And you have a series of expert subcommittees that are composed of the leading scientists on all of these species of concern and all of these processes. We've provided the forum for all of these folks to meet regularly, the sectors and the experts. And we're standing ready to leverage that on any issue that has this sort of regional and multi-sector collaborative approach and need. So we encourage all of you to consider using RWSE as the forum to continue these discussions. And I don't really need to encourage you much more because you kind of are. You invited me to this talk, and we're having this conversation regularly. So to update you on what we've been talking about with these folks, RWSE and our partners at NROC and Marco participated in the workshop that TNC co-hosted with the Roger Williams University School of Law back in April 2023 to explore this issue. Many of you are there. Our steering committee, which is composed of equal representation from the 4 different sectors, they've shared progress from each of their entities and their perspectives pretty regularly since the middle of last year as well, and they've requested that we continue to include it on their agendas. So this is a topic that they're keeping close tabs on and discussing frequently. They meet quarterly. And lastly, I want to just highlight the connections that RWSE has to the regional ocean partnerships on our Atlantic coast. That's the Northeast Regional Ocean Council and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean. I have to look at the acronym every time I say it. NROC and Marco. Those entities are composed of states with a lot of interest in this. So every New England and Mid-Atlantic state participates in either NROC or Marco. And they want to keep talking about this, coordinating with each other, learning from how each other are each dealing with it, and also engaging with federal agencies and other partners. So there's an opportunity to continue discussions through those forums as well. And just to give some ideas on potential activities, how RWSE could play a role, and just to start out and underscore that the steering committee at RWSE drives our work, right? So these are my personal ideas. I have heard some of these ideas from all of you and from our steering committee members, but it's not up to me, Emily, what we do. So these are just some suggestions for how RWSE could help out on this topic. I think that we could really leverage those expert subcommittees to develop recommended guidance or recommended practices on a number of things. For example, what are the project types that could be implemented to achieve net gain, and what are the appropriate methods or actions to implement those projects? There's a real parallel here with the research and monitoring projects that we're already tracking and the conversations we're already having in the subcommittees about how to monitor impacts, and potentially there's some close linkages with ongoing research, and not too much of a leap to either dovetail with mitigation projects or net gain projects or even overlap with them. The subcommittees could also help inform how we monitor performance and success of projects. So what are the potential metrics that we would all want to use, and having collaborative agreement on those might be really helpful for consistency across the Atlantic coast. The monitoring methods, I just basically said that, the monitoring methods to evaluate performance, and my favorite topic, ensuring consistent data collection and sharing. So we know that some of the first projects to try this out, we want to make sure the data are available and lessons learned can be shared, and that the data might be able to be reused for multiple purposes. And that's right in RWSE's wheelhouse, or many of these things are right in RWSE's wheelhouse, and using the tools that we talked about all week with you. So for example, we could expand the current project database that we have to also track mitigation and net gain projects and include those details in the database. We could use the research planning map to plot the points of where these projects are happening and link to contact information for the PIs and where to get additional information and even more. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. So discreetly, what are we going to do? And I have just about 30 seconds to tell you this, and then happy to answer questions in the panel. We're going to continue that sharing through the steering committee and Rock and Marco. We are going to be coordinating with the state of Connecticut on the administration and management of the net gain projects associated with their recent solicitation. We didn't have someone from Connecticut here today, but I encourage folks to go read the solicitation text where it mentions RWSE in this context. It's very short. There's a lot of room for interpretation. And that will be our first task, is to figure out what it means and how we meet Connecticut's goals in the intention of that provision that they put in their solicitation. But I want to underscore the opportunity also to use this work with Connecticut as perhaps the first case study to expand into a regional discussion. How do we interpret what Connecticut has put in that solicitation, and could we make this a joint project across the region that we all work on together? And we could tackle things like, how do we determine a list of acceptable projects that would be implemented, and how might we review projects that developers come to the state of Connecticut and propose in their bids? All things that have not been touched yet to date, and we're really anxious to dig into in this new frontier with you all. So I'll leave it at that, and we can move on to the discussion. Thanks, Trish.
So I'll just invite all of the panelists up. We're going to have a little discussion now. And Emily's right. There's a lot of really great questions. Will we have access to, if we don't get to them today, will we have access to those questions? Because I really think we should endeavor to try to answer a lot of these questions. Or will they disappear? They'll stay? Okay.
You guys can, at least in the short term, you can answer stuff in writing after the session too.
Okay.
But we should be able to get you the full list later.
Okay. So keep asking your great questions, because we will, all of us collectively and in this room, will use those questions to help refine this work, even if we don't answer your questions today. We've touched a bit on how not every state is in the same place. Emily just ended talking about the solicitation from Connecticut, that it specifically includes net gain references and money going to RWSC for implementation. But we know that some states are putting these requirements in and some states aren't quite there yet for a variety of reasons. So I'm curious if we could talk about, maybe we could start even with Emily again, and then the developers. But I'm curious about how these different bid requirements related to NPI from state to state are kind of impacting your work, and what do you think that means for the overall success of MPI.
So, I mean, I think I mentioned yesterday in a description, there's 14 states on the Atlantic coast. Not all of them are actively procuring offshore wind, but many of them are, as we've talked about through the week. So, the biggest challenge with our work, and by that I mean our aggregation and sort of synthesis work and coordination and providing a forum for everybody to have discussions, is that there are so many of you and so many projects, right? It's a scale problem. So as the number of projects increases, or the number of states that procure energy or put these sorts of provisions in their solicitations increases, I think the best thing for everybody, personally, Emily speaking, is to have consistency across all of those things. So if one state's requiring something slightly different than this state over here, it becomes really difficult to have a unifying framework and approach if we have to customize our work to every individual either project and or state, right? So you've got like this multi-factor thing. Do the factorial, right? Like 14 times however many offshore wind developers. Like, oh my goodness. So yeah, I would just, this is why I think RWSE, where we have the states have a caucus and they're already doing this information sharing among each other, right? They're already starting to do that work of trying to be consistent in how they each approach it and learn from each other. So that's great. The developers, I'm not really sure actually how much consistency there is. I know there's consistency in concept across how they approach this, but I think there's a real opportunity to bring everybody together on a much more common and standardized approach that just makes everything predictable and relatively streamlined.
Thank you. So Anthony and Joel, how about that? How does is there a need for consistency across developers? How did the different state requirements impact your work on MPI?
So let's see. So I think consistency is always I think, helpful, and certainty. But I think, from our perspective, right now it's a voluntary ambition for the MPI, and so we kind of have maintained a flexible approach where if, a state like Connecticut puts something specific in requiring net benefits, then we have an amount that's known that they're looking for a net benefits fund. But we also have, in the other bids that have been developed that we've submitted for, like in Rhode Island, there are funds that have been allocated specifically for an NPI, right? Because we know we have to implement it as part of our company goals. And so it hasn't caused too much of an issue in terms of being able to think through and have the conversations about what we would want to do and put into a bid related to NPI and making sure that there's funding in the bid for the NPI. But it is an interesting question. I think it's more of a question across if there's an amount that's proposed in a state to fund a net benefit fund compared with if independently one was thinking about what might we want to put in a net benefit fund, do those kinds of things sync up? And I think that's a really tricky and challenging question to figure out what an amount should be. So I think there's that kind of a question, right? Like is the amount that's being put in for consistency sufficient to achieve the net benefit goals, right? Which I think we're going to be learning a lot over the next decade, right? So.
Yeah, and there are two things I was thinking. So one of them is from a developer's perspective, those differences, like just functionally from responding to them, that can make it a little challenging if the wording is just different enough that you have to have two different approaches. Just from a purely practical standpoint, that can be a little bit of a challenge. Also, too, like there's definitely a need for like full standardization of some things, and like the outputs and the data side, like that is definitely there. I do think though that from a broad sort of conceptual standpoint, I think it's okay at times to have states pushing for things where, as time progresses and new things come up and new options for including things like that come up, just inherently, if this state's already gone and then that thing comes in and then that state goes after, being able to include that is a good thing. And that's just, I think, the inherent nature of a moving timeline with 14 states, like Emily was saying. So yes, standardization, but being able to include new targets, new initiatives, I think is needed.
Can I say one?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I just want to say one thing about kind of on the state level. I don't know if we're ever going to get to a point where we can completely be asking for the same things. Just there's really big differences in what some of the states are asking for and what our goals are. So.
But so sorry, I need to drill down a little bit on that. So like, is there an opportunity for states, multiple states, to work together on this, to develop kind of some consistency relative to some of the standards that you think would benefit MPI?
From my perspective, when we have something like guidance from the RWSC where we can point to that and say, this has, collaboratively been agreed as a really good approach, that makes it easier for us to incorporate it. But I also think that makes it easier for other states to take a standard approach, because we can all point to the same thing. I would also say, I can see my New Jersey colleagues here too, like we're learning from each other as we develop our procurements and then go into contracting. And so we do look to other states to see what they're doing and to see how we can kind of make it more similar and work together.
So one of the really amazing things I think about this topic is that it is a really positive focus, and we have offshore wind companies, major companies, regulators, states, NGOs, all kind of working together to try to achieve a specific outcome. And I'm not sure I've actually ever really seen that in any other development context, where we seem to be kind of getting together to try to solve for the same X, which I think is, I just want to, I guess, put a pin in that and mark it, because I think it's a really fascinating thing about offshore wind development. But I was wondering if we could just talk a little bit, if folks have ideas on what some of the opportunities are that you see that might allow us to better document MPI achievement, improve mitigation decisions, and at the same time give credit to companies that are doing this extra voluntary enhancement restoration work. And it's open field, so if you feel like if it's speaking to you, go with it.
So let's see. So the first part of that, I think we will have a need. I think the good thing, the thing that's going on right now, which is helpful, is that, as I mentioned before, the science-based targets for nature, right, are under development, and there's been some parts of that released already in terms of determining what should be tracked in terms of monitoring both dependencies and impacts on nature. And so I think from a global level that will help standardize things. I think the challenge we have is that we're working, as we work toward doing some of these things, it may be that we're ahead of where those processes are going, right? For example, the science-based targets SB10 work on oceans is just starting off, and they're supposed to have more next year. But I think making sure we're not reinventing the wheel, I guess, would be helpful, right? That we're looking to kind of these global networks of standardization that are being developed to make sure that we're consistently monitoring things in a way that companies will be expected to report out on, I think will be helpful, right? So that we're making sure there's alignment across them, so there's not a whole new set of things that's developed, I think is something that will be helpful for the first part of it, for us, I think.
Yeah, I think more on the practical side, there's a lot of talk on like how we're gonna prioritize where we work at. So like being very deliberate on like the species and habitats we're prioritizing and be very coordinated about that. It's extremely needed, as I said. But also having projects that we know work. So like projects that we have experienced that, like restoration projects that we already have done, that we know they're gonna work, they're gonna have an impact. Projects that the teams and the experts agreeing that those are boots on the ground, we can get them done. So having that like first screening of like where do we want to work, but also like what projects we want to invest on, that's extremely useful.
I will build on. I was going to say something very similar, Marta. That like no. I think really great setup because I mentioned this in our panel prep when we were talking about what we were going to talk about today. That like, are we overthinking this? Like, should we just, we know what projects we know it has positive impact, and we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of the good is the phrase that I used when we were prepping, because we're like kind of paralyzed by inaction, like, oh my God, this is so complex, and like, how do we make sure that we're, having this positive impact? And it's like, well, we know what projects have positive impacts, and I'll probably eat these words like 10 years from now, but like, there's a pretty small chance that a project that someone implements is gonna have a negative benefit, right? I mean, I don't know. So I think we just get started. Like, there's some things, like fairly simple things, lists of projects that have been successful in our region, on our Atlantic ecosystem that we could prioritize as like, these are a pretty good chance that they're going to result in something good. The companies are going to have their own ways within their corporate structure to assess, document, and account for what they've done. We're not going to be able to change that. We could probably learn from that. If you guys are using global or international standards, that's great. But I think having some way to measure it that we all agree on from the entities that are procuring these types of projects, whether it's a state or federal agency or whoever, that's almost more important than the sort of internal accounting that the companies are going to do, in my mind. So that's my suggestion, is to sort of like piecewise work at it and not try to bite off the whole thing all at once and create this big grand framework, because it might be too much and be too late.
I'm going to I want to tie back to, and I think you could probably jump in here too as well, or build on what you were going to say, Shayna, because I want to start building in some of the audience Q&A. And there's this question here that kind of builds on what you were talking about, but also relates to conservation bidding credits. And do you think RWSC or an entity like RWSC could develop a list of actions, voluntary actions, that could be used as an NPI or bid credits, and then let the developers simply state whether they would take those actions? So these could be project specific or like an overall menu of actions.
Yeah, and by RWSC, all of you. That's what that means, right? Like, each state would be like, this is what we'd like to see.
But you're on the stage, Emily.
I know. Fine, it'll be Emily's list at the end of the day. But yeah, so each state can, send us stuff. What would you want to see in your either state waters or the federal waters just outside your boundaries? What do your stakeholders care about, and what do you want to see? Same thing for each of the federal agencies, ENGOs, you guys. It would be a collaborative, collective list that we'd be happy to maintain.
Shayna, do you want to, I cut you off, and you can build on what you were going to say, or just...
Yeah, I always ask Emily to do stuff whenever we're in the same room. I always say, well, RWSC could do that. I think RWSC would be a great forum to make some of those decisions and to bring people together to ask questions. And some of the questions that I've been mulling over that I'd love for RWSC to tackle, and what I've heard from developers or challenges in terms of what projects would count, include an interest from developers in having the benefits that are accrued to a resource that are like incidental to another mitigation that they're conducting that's required. Does that count? Furthermore, do we consider research to count as mitigation? I know that there's people with a varying array of opinions on that. Those questions, I think the RWC would be a phenomenal forum to tackle those in. And I also think another thing that we need to think about, and one that I've heard to tie it back to bid credits specifically, we need some help answering some legal questions. I've had discussions with developers about whether or not they're interested in conservation bid credits, and while some have been very supportive, I've heard a number of different concerns about whether a conservation bid credit would have legal challenges. What types of actions can BOEM offer as a bid credit, and like what's the kind of locus of impact that they have to focus on, if that makes sense. And so in addition to having scientific experts and ENGOs weigh in on this, we definitely need to have, to be sure that we're answering the questions that developers have about whether or not something like a bid credit is going to be attractive and viable for them.
So we have this next question, and I'll just, for our developers, note, think carefully, there's federal regulators in the room, but whoever wants to answer, but it's interesting. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest in understanding the view on the relationship between achieving your MPI goals and satisfying the permit requirements for mitigation. So whoever wants to talk, and yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, can you repeat just the?
So you have your voluntary MPI goals, but you also have permit requirements for mitigation with respect to usually ESA, threatened species. How do you view that relationship between satisfying the permitting requirements and then doing voluntary NPI mitigation?
Well, I could see them as being very much linked. I mean, we should be able to, I think, come up with a system where we're allocating, like, have we met what's required for mitigation, and then have we gone beyond, right? We're developing a system where if a developer wants to do more than what's required by the mitigation, then they can do that. And if it's a project that's being funded for mitigation that's thought to be a good project and could be scaled up to actually be even better, right? That would seem to me to be where there's a nice, in that ideal case, right? There's a nice alignment of being able to satisfy the mitigation goals and then go above to get to meet our voluntary goals. I think the challenges we're going to have to think through, as everyone who works in mitigation knows, right, is how do we deal with then what kind of uncertainty bounds you want to put around that to make sure you're meeting the mitigation and then also going above, right? So your bounds might need to be expanded just a bit more, right, when you're thinking about how to calculate. But I could see I see good alignment in terms of how those two things might work together, and also some efficiencies that we might be able to gain both in looking at the kinds of projects that are prioritized and of interest from a mitigation perspective, which I hope should align with what's being prioritized for MPI, with the exception of the cases where we have, if it's a non-regulated species that comes up in stakeholder discussions of being important, then we'll have to think of a separate kind of process.
And I'm just going to add a little refinement to that, and then you can answer, but let's push on that a little bit, because there are important species that are not listed. Yep. There are important species regardless of whether stakeholders say they're important species, right? That they're important for the overall productivity, for the habitat, generally for the functioning of ecosystem function. And in some cases, there's a disconnect between what you're going to be regulatorily required to do and what might be most beneficial. So, or a priority species that isn't listed. So how do we deal with that?
So I think I view the original question and that follow-up, both of those just within the context of the mitigation hierarchy and the figure that you had up and that you had up, where you go up that ladder or to the right on that ladder. So just I generally think of it within that context of you get to here, and then beyond there is voluntary. I think the other thing is they are coupled, like Anthony was saying, or whatever word you were using. I think because and I didn't have time to get into it on my presentation, but I tried to look at some of the drivers and the initiatives that I had a little bit in chronological order, because I think, if you do a good job of citing and you do a good job of the development of the project and the design of the project and smart engineering decisions, and then you operate it well, like all of those things lead to a lower level of impact to be mitigated in the first place, which then makes NPI easier, right? There's more amount of effort left, the hours in the day left. It just makes that side of the equation a little bit easier to get past.
Anybody?
Oh, and then specifically on the follow-up part, I had on the drivers on my slide stakeholder feedback, and also Kate was talking about working with the twigs on things. So I think that there's outside of like listed species, there's other mechanisms in the process to get that feedback to determine what's important, which that word gets interpreted differently by a lot of different people, but there are mechanisms within the process to get that feedback.
Great, thanks. We have time for one more question, so I'm gonna ask this one, which may not have a clear answer. But, do we need to assign an economic value to MPI? And if we do, how do we do that?
I'm going to be a bad environmental economist, but I think we don't need to assign an NPI value economic value to NPI if we're talking about it in terms of like what is the benefit we get out of it in dollar terms. We obviously need to know how much things are going to cost, right, on that side of things. But I think it can help. I would think in thinking through some of the challenge with the conservation bid credits, right? Right, Shayna. I think as I understand, there are some challenges in terms of how one might be demonstrating the benefit that was received for that credit, and that's where I think there'd have to be some discussion of how you're valuing, these kinds of biodiversity ambitions from a dollar perspective. So I think that's where it would come into play.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. We want these efforts to be measurable. A lot of times measurable means in dollars. And so I do think it's important, although to Emily's point, I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. But yeah, I do think there has to be some measurable way to account for the impacts of a bid credit. We've had some feedback, and I know that there are developers on this stage, so I apologize that I keep saying in discussions that I've had with developers instead of letting developers talk for themselves. It actually wasn't anyone on this stage, but I've had a developer raise this concern to me that if a conservation bid credit were offered, if you didn't have measurable standards to show success, then you could end up having what they felt were bad actors in the space who didn't do as good of a job and then made it difficult for the whole industry because, there's not consistency. Those are things that, I think we certainly want to think about, and having a dollar amount is one way of doing it. Not the only way, though.
And I will say that our challenge is if we try to Emily's point, like if we try to get anyone's tried to put dollar value on natural resources, if we tried to do that as part of these NPI goals, first off, the dollar values are going to be wildly uncertain. And secondly, I think it will take a lot of time and effort to try and figure out how to actually do that effectively across the resources we're talking about. So I think that's where there has to be a middle ground to meet some of the things that you were saying, but also keep pushing ahead.
Thanks. I just want to thank everyone on the panel. We're cutting into the break, so we're gonna end now. I'll ask you to try to answer questions in writing because there's a lot in there. And also, if your question didn't get answered, we do have a joint panel after session number 25, and we can revisit some of these questions that are relevant to that joint panel, or you can re-ask at that time. Thanks.